Okay, so today I've picked out the perfect game to look at for this Halloween season that's equal parts horrific and horrible and... Wait, what's that? It's not What? Oh, it's Christmas. Oh, well, Spawn works well on Christmas, no? No? Look, here's the deal. My exposure to the Spawn character lasted about as long as a cup of coffee. I only read a handful of the comic books, I only saw a few episodes of that animated series that came out in 1997, and I also got to see that rather forgettable live-action movie that also came out the same year, which was apparently dubbed The Year of Spawn for some reason. And there was also a Spawn arcade game that I seem to recall playing at one point, and actually enjoying quite a bit for the most part. All of that took place years ago though. Nowadays, I could hardly remember a detail about the damn character other than that one crossover he had with Batman, and remained somewhat ignorant of Todd McFarlane's cash cow franchise. But the comics are still being produced, and people seem to enjoy them, I suppose, so there's something. While we're on the subject, there was another thing that came out in the so-called Year of Spawn 1997, and that's today's subject matter, Spawn the Eternal, for the original PlayStation. I had been curious about this one for a while, and truth be told, I didn't pay a whole lot for this one, even though the game itself was in fairly decent condition. Spawn the Eternal had gotten some really poor reactions, and not a whole lot of people seemed to like this one. But despite this, I still wanted to give it a shot, and hey, it was fairly cheap, so... You know that moment when somebody asks what could possibly go wrong, and it's usually followed by something going horrifically wrong? Well, what could possibly go wrong? Spawn the Eternal has the misfortune of being released prior to the formal introduction of the DualShock analog controller, and it shows because controlling Spawn with the directional pad feels cumbersome and awkward. Spawn moves at too quickly a speed that when you need to make more precise movements you need to inch your way forwards or to the side or whatever direction you need to go, and that in itself tends to be unwieldy. Turning Spawn left or right is slow and sluggish. You have two quote-unquote attacks that serve nothing more than to break bits of scenery and furniture in hopes of finding items such as hell gauntlets and other things. You have a roll maneuver which serves no real purpose other than to theoretically avoid hazards, a first-person view that kinda sorta helps in giving you a better view of your surroundings, and a jump that works, despite being mapped to triangle. It's perhaps the least intuitive control scheme I've had to put up with. But I suppose I'm just being picky in this regard. After all, there have been plenty of 3D based games on the PlayStation pre-DualShock, and some of those turned out alright. Maybe it's just me being a nitpicky. No. Because every so often the game will shift to this poor man's one-on-one fighting game engine. Theoretically, you have special moves, such as projectile weapons and the ability to rip your opponent's arm off and beat them to death with it, but pulling off these maneuvers are a miracle that exists in some other realm of reality. Sometimes they work. Barely. But more often than not, you're just better off mashing buttons. Mind you, I do believe you'd be best served playing something else instead, but for the purposes of this review, we're playing this. For some reason. For the most part, the main premise behind Spawn the Eternal is theoretically simple. It's essentially a dungeon crawler of sorts. You roam around a labyrinth, searching for specific key items that will open specific doors to progress onwards. Every so often you'll run into enemies that you'll have to confront, and at times you'll encounter pickups that will heal you, or give you animation for the various projectile attacks that you can theoretically pull off in the fighting segments. There are hazards that you'll have to avoid, and there is some platforming that you have to do. And the platforming is a bit of a hassle at times, but it is there. In theory, not a bad idea, even if it's a bit underwhelming for your comic book fare. There is one minor issue though. There's no inventory feature to check out what you've gathered up thus far. When you press start, you're given a simple option screen allowing you to save your game, load your game, adjust the sound levels, or quit the game. Because the chances of you playing this game in one shot is slim to none, due to the length of the game lasting several hours at least, if you last that long, you'll have no real indication as to what you have in your possession. As such, there will be instances where you might backtrack to get a key item that is already in your possession, but because you can't access your inventory of keys to keep track of the keys you collected, it can be difficult to keep track of your progress. It's not an outright game killer, but it is an oversight that's noticeable. But even with the inclusion of an inventory feature that would have helped, Spawn the Eternal is generally boring, essentially boiling down to Spawn roaming around empty corridors while occasionally fighting bad guys, occasionally avoiding hazards, and occasionally doing some platforming which involved pits. Despite the large number of levels and some unique hazards, every level is largely the same thing with different skins and slightly different layouts. Even the enemies, which supposedly vary between the 4 realms of the game, are basically reskins of the same basic type, with only a couple possessing more than a collection of punches and kicks. It's one of those cases where it feels like you've seen everything that the game has to offer within a couple hours of gameplay. It's also one of those cases where Spawn would have been better off as a straight up beat 'em up type of game rather than a slow plotting dungeon crawler type thing. But if there was any real positive to Spawn the Eternal, it's that the game has a save feature akin to what you'd get with some old PC games, in that other than during the fight sequences, you can save at any point at any time in the game and as many times as you wish, and if you die, you can simply reload your last save. Mind you, the process to save and load games takes about a half minute respectively, and this is one of those releases where you'd need an official Sony memory card to guarantee that your game will be saved, as several third-party memory cards I've tested weren't recognized or were read as corrupted, even though they worked fine on other games. This isn't a Spawn exclusive thing, however, as I've had the same issue with the PS1 port of Final Fantasy VI. It's just something I thought I'd point out, but still, it's a nice, flexible save system that's much appreciated for a game that has few bright spots, and I'm not just talking about the visuals. Speaking of which, Spawn the Eternal looks drab, dreary, dull, depressing, and dreadful, and if that was the intention, then they've succeeded. But in all seriousness, this looks pretty bad. Now, it's difficult to look back at old PlayStation 1 titles in this day and age, because a lot of those games nowadays have simply not aged well in the slightest, especially in regards to the visual department. There are exceptions to this, of course, but for the most part you'll find games on the PS1 library that have a rough, grainy, messy, and at times blocky appearance, and Spawn the Eternal definitely fits the bill in this regard. There are instances where the game looks adequate, mostly in regards to level textures that are simple looking and clean, such as brick walls or solid doors, but when it comes to textures with a bit more detail, such as city buildings and rocky caverns, they look really messy and unappealing to look at. There are 3 incarnations of Spawn in this game, apparently something of a big deal back in the day. With the exception of the primal Spawn, who looks like a walking turd, both regular Spawn and medieval Spawn look almost identical save for some minor details. I didn't bring this up earlier because it's not that important. For the purposes of the game, you're playing the same character, only with different skins. You may as well be playing as one single Spawn rather than the pretense of 3 separate ones. And the same can be said for the enemy designs. Outside of the major recognizable bosses like Overkill or Violator, most of the enemies, as bland and rough looking as they are pretty much just the same base enemy with no real unique properties. Maybe if they only had one skin of Spawn and one skin of enemy, there'd be resources left over to make the characters look a little better than blocky, rough looking characters. The biggest culprit of this visual tour de merde is the god-awful camera, which has a tendency to not allow you the privilege of seeing where you are or where you're going. Yes, there is the first-person camera that you could bring up to survey your surroundings, but this only pops up for as long as you hold the appropriate button. Outside of that, there's no way of manipulating the camera to get a better view of where you're at. The camera is always in the most inconvenient angle when in close corners, often looking at a wall that Spawn is standing behind. Or maybe it's at some other angle that's detrimental to your progress. It's pretty terrible. And there's also the occasional bit of clipping that seems odd. Yeah, it looks pretty bad, but Spawn the Eternal does do something right. It is a suitably dark world after all, appropriate for the world that Spawn inhabits. And animations for when Spawn is running or fighting about is fluid, at least, with little to no jerky motions. So it moves about well enough, it just doesn't look good. Whether it be blurry characters or grainy textures or that thing that's supposed to be the sky, that doesn't look too good either. It's actually making me sick. Atmospheric background noise fills the ears in an attempt to create some semblance of ambience and mood, but it seems like all I'm getting is a sour case of Meniere's syndrome. A disease of the labyrinth of the ear characterized by deafness, ringing in the ears, dizziness, and nausea. In fairness, there are instances in the later levels where the usual repetitive noise is replaced with something resembling background music, but this is far few in between, and even that sounds a bit lame. If the intent was to create a hellish atmosphere with the score, it's not really working. During the fighting sequences, you have some generic sounding rock tunes that are pretty forgettable for the most part. They don't even sound that good, to be honest with you, and they're also kind of hurting my ears. Sound effects are pretty worthless. Stock fight sounds, stock voice bites, stock everything. Just about the only decent bit is the opening video, and even that's somewhat average at best. So, yeah. If I could give Spawn the Eternal an alternative title, it would be Spawn the Cure for Insomnia. If it isn't roaming about dull-looking locales looking for power-ups or keys to progress onwards while putting up with cumbersome controls, it's putting up with lame one-on-one fighting contests with worthless controls and equally worthless attacks that are compounded by relentless AI that does more than its fair share to transform Spawn from badass to suck-ass in no time flat. The Spawn character and the franchise in general has potential to make for a good game, and I've played that game somewhat in the arcades. When it comes to Spawn the Eternal on PlayStation, this is not so much. On a whole, don't be fooled by the shiny cover, this ain't worth it.